18 days. That's how long it took a Chinese container ship to sail from China to the United Kingdom. Not 40 days, not a month and a half, 18 days. And this wasn't a test run. It wasn't a one-time experiment or a publicity stunt. This ship was the first vessel on a fully operational new maritime route, one that now permanently connects Asia to Europe. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. This route doesn't pass through the Suez Canal. It doesn't touch the Panama Canal. It doesn't rely on any of the world's traditional choke points. Instead, it quietly bypasses them all. At first glance, this sounds like a story about faster shipping, but that's not what this is really about. Speed is just the surface. What this actually changes is who controls the arteries of global trade, and who suddenly has much less leverage than before. For decades, global commerce has flowed through narrow passages controlled, influenced, or protected by a small number of powerful countries. That system shaped prices, alliances, and even wars. Now, China has opened a route that simply goes around it. So what exactly is this route? Why is it opening now, at this moment in global politics? And why are some people in Washington quietly viewing this as very bad news? To answer that, we need to understand how global shipping has worked up until now, and why choke points matter more than most people realize. Global trade has never been as free as it looks on a map. On paper, the oceans seem wide open. In reality, most of the world's goods are squeezed through a handful of narrow passages called choke points. These are the pressure valves of the global economy. When they work, trade flows smoothly. When they fail, everything backs up. The most important route between Asia and Europe runs through two critical points, the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal. More than half of all trade between Asia and Europe passes through this single corridor. Even more important, over 60% of Middle Eastern oil heading to Asia depends on it. That means energy, manufacturing, and daily life across entire continents rely on just a few hundred kilometers of water. Then there's the Panama Canal. It's smaller in volume but massive in influence. It acts like a shortcut button for global shipping, allowing ships to avoid sailing all the way around South America. Before it existed, a trip from New York to San Francisco could take 2 months. After the canal opened, that journey dropped to about 2 weeks, saving hundreds of thousands of dollars per ship. Finally, there's the Cape of Good Hope. This is the emergency exit. When everything else fails, ships go this way. But it's longer, slower, and far more expensive. It's the route no one wants to use unless they have no choice. If this all sounds fragile, that's because it is. In 2021, a single container ship, the Ever Given, got stuck in the Suez Canal. One ship, one accident, and suddenly, global supply chains froze. Hundreds of vessels piled up. Factories ran short of parts. Prices jumped worldwide. It was a real-world reminder that modern trade depends on incredibly thin margins. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of these choke points sit under foreign geopolitical influence. For a country like China, the world's largest manufacturing hub, that dependence is a strategic risk. If these routes are pressured, restricted, or disrupted, China doesn't just lose time. It risks losing energy, exports, and economic stability. This is the system China has relied on for decades. And it's exactly the system China started looking for a way around. China is often described as an unstoppable economic machine. But even the biggest machines have weak points. China manufactures more goods than any other country on Earth. From smartphones to solar panels, from clothing to electric vehicles, Chinese factories feed global markets every single day. But all of that production depends on one thing working smoothly: shipping. China also has a second, even bigger dependency: energy. It imports massive amounts of oil and natural gas to keep its factories running, its cities lit, and its economy growing. Here's the problem. Almost all of that trade moves through the same narrow maritime corridors we just talked about. That means China's lifelines, exports going out and energy coming in, are concentrated in just a few choke points thousands of kilometers from its shores. This creates serious risks. If sanctions tighten, shipping costs can rise overnight. If ports restrict access, deliveries slow down. If conflict breaks out near key waterways, insurance rates explode and ships reroute. And these aren't theoretical risks. In recent years, Chinese vessels have faced higher port fees, stricter inspections, and growing political pressure in certain regions. Each extra cost doesn't just hurt shipping companies, it ripples back to factories, workers, and consumers. Think of it like this. If a city has only one bridge connecting it to the outside world, that bridge becomes a vulnerability. You don't need to destroy the city, you just need to control the bridge. For China, global shipping lanes were that bridge. So when Beijing looked at the map, it wasn't asking, how do we ship faster? It was asking, what happens if this bridge is suddenly restricted? The answer was uncomfortable. China wasn't chasing efficiency alone. It was chasing security. And security means having more than one way in and out. That question set the stage for a solution most people once thought was unrealistic. For decades, the Arctic Ocean was treated like a wall, not a highway. Ice, darkness, extreme weather, it was considered too dangerous, too seasonal, and too unreliable for serious commercial shipping. At best, it was a niche route for specialized vessels. At worst, it was dismissed entirely. Then China quietly changed the calculation. On September 20th, a Chinese container ship departed from eastern China and did something that would have sounded unrealistic just a few years ago. It sailed north, passed through Arctic waters, and reached the United Kingdom in just 18 days. From there, it continued on to Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Gdansk, linking the UK, Northern Europe, and the Baltic into a single continuous logistics chain. This wasn't a shortcut on paper, it was a real operational route. The reason it matters becomes clear when you compare distances. The traditional route through the Suez Canal is about 12,800 nautical miles. The Arctic route cuts that down to roughly 8,000 to 8,900 nautical miles. That's nearly a 30% reduction. In shipping terms, that's enormous. Shorter routes mean less fuel, fewer days at sea, lower insurance exposure, and faster delivery for high-value goods. But the emotional weight of this moment goes beyond numbers. What was once considered extreme, seasonal, and impractical is now repeatable. This wasn't luck or perfect weather. It was the result of preparation meeting opportunity. For the first time, China had a maritime route to Europe that didn't rely on the world's traditional gateways. And that raises the obvious question. How did China make something like this possible in the first place? The Arctic route didn't suddenly appear because the ice melted one summer. It exists because of years of quiet, methodical preparation. Around 2022, China began treating polar shipping not as an experiment, but as a long-term strategic project. New shipping companies were created with a specific focus on Arctic operations. These weren't ordinary container ships. They were ice-class vessels, designed with reinforced hulls, specialized engines, and navigation systems built for extreme conditions. But ships alone weren't enough. The Arctic is unforgiving. You can't simply sail through and hope for the best. That's where Russia enters the picture. Russia controls much of the northern coastline and already operates the world's largest fleet of icebreakers. Through cooperation agreements, China gained access to icebreaker escorts to guide ships through heavy ice, Arctic ports for refueling and emergency support, and navigation and communication systems suited for polar regions. This partnership solved the biggest practical problems that had kept Arctic shipping limited for decades. Just as importantly, infrastructure crossed a critical threshold. Ports, rescue stations, and logistics hubs reached a point where commercial shipping became not just possible, but manageable. The risks didn't disappear, but they dropped enough for companies to plan around them. And that's the key difference. Strategic routes don't open when conditions are perfect. They open when uncertainty becomes acceptable. This wasn't rushed. It wasn't flashy. It took years of coordination, testing, and investment before the first fully operational route could be announced. Big shifts in global power rarely arrive with a headline at the start. They arrive quietly and only make noise once they're already in motion. And once this route was open, its implications went far beyond logistics. For decades, the United States hasn't needed to block global trade to influence it. It only needed leverage. That leverage came from geography and control. Key shipping routes, or the countries that host them, sat within U.S. strategic reach. Whether through alliances, security guarantees, or economic pressure, Washington had tools to shape how global trade flowed. In recent years, those tools were used more openly. The United States increased pressure on Panama over Chinese involvement near the canal. Fees and regulatory costs for Chinese ships entering U.S. ports were raised. Policies were introduced that made certain routes more expensive and less predictable for Chinese companies. The goal wasn't to stop trade. It was to make trade costlier, slower, and easier to influence. But the Arctic route changes that equation. This new path avoids the Panama Canal. It bypasses the Suez Canal, and it doesn't depend on U.S.-aligned maritime choke points. For China, that means something simple but powerful options. High-value exports like electronics, electric vehicles, and industrial equipment benefit the most from shorter, more secure routes. So do energy imports from Russia, which can now move with less exposure to traditional pressure points. This is why the concern isn't loud, it's quiet. Control doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes when alternatives become real. And in global trade, control doesn't disappear, it shifts. This time, that shift didn't move west. It's tempting to look at the Arctic route and think China is trying to replace the old system. That's not what's happening. China isn't betting everything on one new path. It's doing something much more cautious and much more strategic. It's building layers. Alongside Arctic shipping, China has spent the past decade expanding the China-Europe Railway Express. What started as a handful of experimental freight trains has grown into hundreds of routes connecting dozens of countries across Eurasia. Today, these trains carry a significant share of China-Europe trade, especially time-sensitive goods. At the same time, China has signed shipping and logistics agreements with more than 60 countries, spreading its maritime connections across nearly every major coastline. Traditional sea routes still handle the bulk of trade, because nothing moves volume cheaper than a container ship. Each route has trade-offs. Rail is fast, but expensive and limited in capacity. Arctic shipping is shorter, but seasonal and weather-dependent. Traditional sea routes are cheap and massive, but exposed to choke points. Instead of choosing one, China is stacking options. Think of it like an electrical grid. If all your power comes from one line, a single failure causes a blackout. But if power flows from multiple sources, the system becomes resilient. That's the real strategy here. China isn't trying to dominate global trade routes overnight. It's trying to make sure no single disruption can shut it down. That shift, from dependence to redundancy, is what makes this story bigger than one ship or one route. And it leads to the final question. What does all of this mean in the long run? It's important to stay grounded. The Arctic route is not about to replace the Suez Canal. It won't suddenly rewrite global trade flows next year. Seasonal limits still exist, and Arctic infrastructure is far from complete. For now, this route works best during a narrow window each year, often requiring icebreaker support and careful planning. Costs can still be higher, and risks haven't disappeared. But that's not the real story. The real story is direction. Climate change is slowly reshaping the Arctic. Ice-free periods are getting longer. What was once navigable for a few weeks may, in the coming decades, remain open for months. Some projections suggest that 30 to 40 years from now, parts of the Arctic could be usable for nearly half the year. When that happens, the countries that prepared early won't be catching up. They'll already be in position. This route isn't really about shaving days off shipping time. It's about who prepares first for the next global system and who waits until the rules have already changed. Trade routes shape power. They always have. And when routes change, influence follows. If you want to understand where global trade, geopolitics, and power are heading, not after it happens, but before, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the biggest shifts in the world don't arrive suddenly. They arrive quietly and only look obvious in hindsight.